Hello everyone and welcome back. In today's video I'm going to be painting the Lion's non-metallic or Obsidian sword. However, this recipe could also be used on a lot of other Dark Angel swords. First of all, I've given the part a coat of Tamiya light grey primer. However, you could really use any primer you prefer. Black, white or grey is fine. As next, I'm going to be base coating the entire blade using Dawnstone Grey. This is a good mid-tone grey to which I can start to add some shadows and highlights to. And it took me around 2 to 3 coats to get a nice even coverage. I then started to glaze some Skaven Blight Dinge into the shadows, thinning this with around 3 parts water to 1 part paint. I'm directing this glaze with the brush, pushing it from the areas where I want to start the transition to the deepest and more intense part of the shading. And if you have watched the previous fundamentals video, then I cover this technique in much more detail there, so do consider checking that out if you're new to glazing. It's going to take a few layers to build up a nice smooth transition, and I'm not worried too much if it's not completely smooth at this stage, as I'll be going back over these areas a lot more later on. Oh, and also if you don't have this exact grey tone, then it could easily be replaced with any other darker grey, something like Eshin or Mechanicus. At this stage, I'm just creating the initial volumes, before then going on to add some more colours into the blade. Next, I started to add a cold blue-green tone by mixing Incubi Darkness into the Skaven Blight Dinge. Now, how much you add of this colour is going to be down to your own taste. I didn't want to overdo it with this to begin with, so I just mixed it with equal parts Skaven Blight. Again, using this at a glaze consistency to accentuate the already established shadows. Next up, I added some black into the mix to further push the contrast in the shadows. As I'm working darker in colour, I tend to thin the glaze a bit further each time for a more subtle effect, saving this stage for the most extreme parts of the shadows. Now the shading was established, it was time to push some more contrasting, brighter highlights onto the blade. For this, I wanted a slightly warmer highlight colour, so I mixed Ushabti Bone into Administratum Grey, and I then glazed this onto the brighter grey areas of the blade. Now, if you are happy with this look, then you can pretty much just run an edge highlight around the edge and call it a day. However, this time I wanted a look that was closer to the box art, so I used this highlight colour to establish some similar reflections on the blade surface, using some images as a guide. And if you are unsure about where to place highlights, it can often be a great idea to find some kind of reference images. Working out these lighter reflections directly over the darker areas and almost sketching them in meant that I was left with some rougher transitions, so I did have to go back and carefully glaze around the outside of these with some darker stages to help smooth them out. It's important at this stage not to panic and think that you've ruined anything, as it really just takes a bit of patience going back through the stages to smooth out the transitions. And it did take me a few glazes back and forth to eventually achieve a smooth result, making lots of small adjustments with the brush and still working with a glaze consistency paint so that I didn't build up too much unwanted texture. Once I'd gotten these transitions relatively smooth, I started to add some AK white into the previous mix to further push the highlights onto the brightest parts of the blade. Again, I'm trying to build this up quite softly to begin with and over a few thinner layers. As these areas are already quite bright, I shouldn't end up with too much of a chalky look. But if you do start to get this, then I advise building up more layers of this glaze and then using the next stage down to smooth out the transitions around the outside. It was then time to add some highlights around the edge of the blade using the same highlight mix. I advise picking a sharper brush than I did for this, and also using the side of the brush where you can to pick out these longer sharp edges. As long as you're careful to avoid any overspill, then it's perfectly fine to do this, and it'll save you some headaches in the long run trying to freehand the line. Just make sure to remove any excess paint from the brush first. Now to add the power effect to the blade, and for this I use Sotek Green to begin with, carefully painting this over the nodes and then creating some softer glazes around the outside for a subtle OSL effect. And there's a lot of different tealy greens that you could also use for this. Cabalite would also work well for a slightly greener result. Now looking at the box art again, it did appear slightly greener to me, so I adjusted this for the first highlight colour, making a mix between Sybarite Green and Temple Guard Blue. I used this to pick out some highlights on the nodes themselves, and also to push the reflections at the top of the node. I then added some AK white into this mix for the final highlights. A few final tweaks were then made, and some spot highlights of pure AK white were then added to finish off the blade itself. Now that's about it for this video. In the next part of the line, I'll be continuing on with the non-metallics, this time tackling the gold areas on the miniature. I'm pleased to say that with the announcement of Golden Demon in Germany, that I'm planning to create a vlog style series of videos on the run up from early in the idea development stage through to the final results, as well as continuing on with the next part of the Fundamentals series on edge highlights. So I look forward to catching you all again very soon.